But 10
Isn't it early for Brazilian time? 10:02?
It's 11 here.
11:02?
So we're off to lunch.
It's true.
Ai, ai. One second. Conforme o pessoal se adequa. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I will switch to Portuguese first to give instructions on the simultaneous translation and then back to English for today. Então, bom dia. Bom dia a todos e todas. Vou dar as instruções sobre a tradução simultânea para quem já esteve com a gente nos últimos dias. É uma repetição, mas a gente vem dizendo que repetição é parte da vida psíquica da política internacional. Então, mais uma vez, o seminário conta com tradução simultânea português e inglês, realizada por intérpretes em treinamento do curso de formação de intérpretes de conferência da PUC-Rio. Então, antes de tudo, a gente agradece mais uma vez à equipe pela disposição e auxílio indispensável para que esse evento esteja acontecendo e tantas de nós possam estar participando conjuntamente. Para que a tradução corra bem, pedimos que façam suas falas e perguntas pausadamente. Caso você queira ativar a tradução, basta clicar no ícone do globo que está no canto inferior à direita do seu Zoom e selecionar português, assim como a opção desativar som original. Para voltar a ouvir o floor, né, os palestrantes, basta selecionar a opção off no mesmo ícone. Um bom seminário para todas nós. So back to English for the simultaneous translation instructions. There is a simultaneous translation between Portuguese and English for the seminar enabled by the team of training interpreters from the conference interpreter training program of PUC-Rio. We thank the team for their availability and hard work, without which these encounters would be, or at least the size and connectivity of this encounter would be impossible. For the translation to work smoothly, we ask everyone, including myself, to speak slowly. If you need to activate the translation, just click on the globe on the bottom right side of your Zoom and select English, plus the mute original sound option. And then to get back to listening to the floor and the speakers in their original language, just click on the same globe and select off. If you were watching us on YouTube, I believe we still have room in the Zoom, and the translation is not sent to YouTube, so join us here. Unfortunately, Professor Angela McRobbie will not be able to join us today, as she is recovering from health issues, recovering being the key word here, which means she's doing well. And she sent her apologies for not being with us today. So, our conversations in the last few days have touched upon and raised the issue of capitalism many times. Indeed, if capitalism seems to be back in the agenda for so many of us who had been allowed to leave it to the side, its connection with desires, affects, and enjoyment has never really been a marginal issue for those fighting against that allowed forgetfulness. It is thus only fitting that right in the middle of this week, like a real wound being encircled, we address capital and capitalism directly, but also in relation to what we've been doing and what we will do moving forward. So it's a pleasure to have this conversation today and to have Naim and Samo as speakers and provocateurs for this conversation. I will introduce them before they speak so that we have their bio and their talk close to each other. Okay, so Naim. Naim is a professor in the Department of Politics at Ithaca College and a longtime friend of our department, having joined us as a visiting scholar in 2010. His research interests include global and cultural political economy, culture and identity in international relations, narrative, writing, pedagogy, and music. He's one of the founders of institutionalized and not so institutionalized communities, centering colonialism and capitalism in IR, an inheritance from which many of us have immensely benefited and to which I, among many others, am personally grateful. As part of this, he is the author with David Blaney of the book International Relations and the Problem of Difference, and of Savage Economics, Wealth, Poverty, and the Temporal Walls of Capitalism, a book which we still need to learn how to read. He is the editor of Autobiographical International Relations and with Elizabeth Dauphiné of Narrative Global Politics, as well as associate editor of the Journal of Narrative Politics. His forthcoming works include the manuscript on pedagogy and another with Blaney on the critique of liberal IPE, International Political Economy, and global capitalism, on which we'll hear him today. So without further ado, I love this expression in English. Naim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to get right into it. The title is Capital Love is Riven. It comes in 6 sections. The first and the 6th section are short. The 4 middle ones are a bit longer. Okay, so 1, the beacon. It was 1960. I was 4, living in Peshawar, Pakistan. My father worked as a village researcher at the Academy for Rural Development, a Ford Foundation funded project, manned by professors from Michigan State University. The Academy was one of many development missions spread through Latin America, Africa, and Asia, as well as a wall against communist influence. It was a compass, a gateway, and a beacon to a future foretold by Western social science. My father owned a black Volkswagen Bug. His proudest possession was parked next to our house, itself adjacent to the Academy grounds. The Academy's architecture was clean-edged, cooled, cemented, and speckled with ice-cold water fountains every 500 feet. As I watch myself looking back at that time, I am torn. A part of me needs that life to seem incorruptible. I want to keep my faith in a steady climb towards the tangible summit of developmental progress. Still, today, now. 2, releasing envy. Marx does not begin his magnum opus with the bloody origins of capitalism's prehistory. He presents that violence at the end of Volume 1. This placement is not accidental. Marx does not title his book Capitalism, but rather Capital. This too, of course, is no accident. Capitalism, the system, and capital, the concept, are different. We need this difference to engage capitalism on its best terms. Capitalism is an experiment that builds a social machine, a machine that extols greed, self-interest, and envy creation instead of repressing them. A repression universal to all cultures until capitalism. It's a machine that converts it's a machine that converts private vice into public good through markets. Capitalism's fuel, self-interest, greed, envy, pollutes and wreaks havoc on nature, on family, on the state, on religious institutions. Capitalism slashes and burns traditions and builds everything anew. All that was solid melts into air. Capitalism contains 2 dynamic forces and a novel social form. The dynamic forces are competition to the death and an explosive increase in technology due to the internalization of innovation into its own circuits. These 2 create massive changes in skill, in consumption, in patterns of life, and in our relationship to nature. At the center of capitalism's historical mission is the idea of creative destruction. The peculiar social form is its asocial sociality. In the global division of labor, our labor touches the labor of others through exchange. Our labors are intimate, but we remain strangers to each other, separated as much by oceans as by systematic distancing. Asocial sociality, our labors touch, but we do not. Capitalism is the historical and incidental means by which we come to realize the centrality of wealth creation. Wealth creation, termed simply capital, is foundational for human emancipation from nature's indifference and for the full flowering of humans as aesthetic beings. Are the two separable? Can we have innovation and creative destruction without staging competitions to the death? Can we separate capital from capitalism? Capitalism takes us to capital, and capital takes us beyond the laws of nature. This is not an unfamiliar idea. I can ground it in popular culture. In the science fiction show Star Trek, the replicator is a shorthand for the arrival of capital beyond capitalism. I walk up to the replicator and I say Earl Grey warm, and I get a cup of tea. I say Penang curry with shrimp, and I get my dinner. I say jetpack, and I can start flying. I can go to the holodeck and create an artistic studio. And ultimately, I can create technology for terraforming. That is, technology that transforms entire planets so that they are habitable by human beings. Star Trek presents capital without capitalism. Fiction, of which science fiction is a part, is really about what the present can become. So I return to the question, can we have capital without capitalism? Maybe the point is merely to ask the question. As Einstein is supposed to have said, answers are inevitable once we find the questions. I want to think that can we separate capital from capitalism is the right question. Capital might be the utopic gleam in capitalism, its rational kernel. 3, arbitrariness, which is a hard word to say for me, and I'm going to say it many times. Allow me 2 assumptions: that human beings are meaning makers besides being tool makers and beauty makers, and that arbitrariness is the meaning killer. That is, humans find it impossible to tolerate arbitrariness, so they hone their skills to overturn it. Here's a quick speculative history based on these 2 assumptions. But before I present it, you might think that what I'm about to say is bad history, that things didn't happen like this. If you believe this, historians and anthropologists will support you. But a speculative history doesn't tell us what happened. It tells us what might have happened for us to be what we want to be. As an analogy, think of the person who lies to their analyst about the dream they had last night. For the analyst, it matters less that it is a lie than the fact that the person chose that particular lie. Likewise, it matters less that a speculative history is fiction than the fact that we can recognize ourselves in it. So as I tell the story, I invite you to think less about what is wrong with it and more about what the fiction illuminates about us. Phase 1, hunters and gatherers. For hunting and gathering societies, nature produces arbitrariness in the form of placing finite resources within the traveling range of hunters and gatherers. This forces them to move to new areas when they have depleted the resources. Nature's distribution of resources seems arbitrary. Also arbitrary were tidal waves, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, droughts, floods. Nature's operations seem random in their relationship to humans. The solution? Create agricultural societies that allow for a certain level of wealth to be generated and stored. Phase 2, agricultural societies. In agricultural societies, the usual belief is that what you receive from the social product depends on your birth station. Kings and nobility get everything. Slaves and serfs get next to nothing. To the bourgeoisie emerging around the time of the French and the Haitian revolutions, such reliance on birth stations seemed arbitrary. Solution: move from ascribed status to achieved status. Here, one's rank, station, and worth are meant to result from effort and merit. The ideals of meritocracy overcome the arbitrariness of the divine right of kings. Phase 3, market society. Market society uses meritocracy as an adjacent and supportive ideology. I say adjacent because the principle of the market is not that you get according to merit and effort. Rather, you get according to the property that you can sell to others. You can become a millionaire if you provide handheld computers or vaccines. But you can also become a millionaire if you can provide things of seemingly dubious worth like chewing gum, potato chips, or carbonated drinks. Meanwhile, teachers and healthcare providers often need 2 or more jobs just to get by. What others will purchase of our property seems like an arbitrary way to secure income. Can we think of ways to eliminate this kind of arbitrariness? This too, I think, is the right question. Our bodies know this. Our bodies know this. 4, Hayek's ghost. By the way, this is the most difficult section, so seatbelts on. Hayek's ghost. Allow me to detail what our bodies might know. You might think that promoters of capitalism would encourage our belief in meritocracy, and they do. But that encouragement contains a deep worry. My favorite native informant on this topic is the famed libertarian Friedrich Hayek. Hayek insists that the phrase "all men are born equal" means only that legally and morally all men ought to be treated alike. It does not mean that we tie ourselves to what he calls factual equality. Factual equality reduces everyone to sameness, in Hayek's view. Treating everyone alike before the law requires us to accept that individual differences will produce dissimilar levels of income and status. Such differentials in wealth and status may be seen as just, even if the gap between the lowest and the highest seems severe. For Hayek, redistributive schemes, including taxes, are forms of discrimination and coercion that make people alike. Hayek believes that most people will accept factual inequality. Nevertheless, he fears that they will do so for the wrong reason. The right reason is that they should envision it as the just result of a free society. The wrong reason is that they imagine inequality reflects the relationship between merit and reward. That is, most people accept factual inequality only if it reflects differences in merit, roughly conceived as a combination of talent and effort. If I make more than you, it's because I work harder or possess more skills than you. Hayek finds the desire for proportionality between merit and reward indefensible. He boldly observes, the value which a person's capacity or services have for us and for which he is compensated has little relation to anything we can call merit or deserve. He rebukes our bodily intuitions by saying, in a free system, it is not desirable that material rewards should be made to correspond to what men recognize as merit. For Hayek, the meritocratic ideal is stupid. It is also dangerous. If people believe that merit and reward ought to correlate, then what will happen when they discover that actual life fails to match this ideal? His anxious answer? They'll be tempted to act on the ideal by taking the property of some and giving it to others. For Hayek, this would be, as I said, discrimination, coercion, and theft. Nevertheless, Hayek worries that if he exposes the disconnection between merit and reward, something terrible will happen. As the famed libertarian Robert Nozick laments, for some reason, people want their societies to be just and to look just. It is this popular need that makes meritocracy such a dangerous falsehood. Market society, for Hayek, provides something far more important than a clear connection between merit and reward. It allows people to enjoy advantages in proportion to the benefits which their fellows derive from their activities. That is, markets require us all to be other-directed. Our own enjoyment and advantage depends on how well we can supply what others enjoy. All this happens spontaneously without any person or any institution commanding us. For Hayek, the freedom within a spontaneously generated social order trumps all other values. If such an order produces extreme inequality, We must accept this as the price we pay to live in what Hayek calls a free society. Now here's the twist. In a different book, Hayek admits that his favorite position might be too discouraging, especially to those at the beginning of their working lives. He laments that a market order requires individuals to believe that their well-being depends primarily on their own efforts and their own decisions, however untrue that might actually be. Therefore, rather than exposing the break between merit and reward, he recommends that we foster this misconception. We must lie. In sum, Hayek demonstrates that there is no logical connection between the principle of a market society and the ideals of meritocracy. Nevertheless, Hayek worries that the removal of that connection can undermine market society itself. This impossibility is what he wants both to expose and to conceal. We might see Hayek's dilemma as a wound in the social body. We're interpolated into accepting that our location in the social hierarchy results from our talent and our effort, and we harbor the eerie sensation that there is no such connection. Our bodies know what we don't want to know. Our bodies know what we don't want to know. 5, faith. Can we eliminate this kind of arbitrariness? Here's one way. I can claim no one deserves anything. I can claim that we should throw out the concept of deservingness. Our means to life should instead be a right, like voting, like free speech, like the right to assembly. We do not have to show that we deserve rights. We have them merely because we count as humans. We don't have to do anything. New problem. The negation of deservingness destroys previous principles, but it does not give us a new principle. New solution. Everyone should get the same. Problem. Not everyone needs the same. Some need more, others need less. Solution. We have the right to get what we need. This principle eliminates, I think, the arbitrariness of the merit and market principles. But the right to receive what we need requires wealth, capital, and capital accumulation. There are a lot of people on this planet. They have a lot of needs. To meet their needs, we will require more wealth. There's a lot of work for capital to do. Can we have capital without capitalism? The hope of a positive reply to this question must have been why I said at the start that I want to keep my faith in a steady climb towards the tangible summit of developmental progress. 6th and last section. Here is what our bodies know, but also conceal from us. We need wealth, capital, and capital accumulation, even as wealth and capital seem to be killing us. We need meaning and principles to fend off arbitrariness, even if the arbitrary seems to haunt us. Capital and capitalism are different, but our conflation of these terms allows us to support capitalism even while we vociferously critique it. The meritocratic principle we receive according to our effort or merit differs from the market principle we receive according to the kind and amount of property we can sell. However, our conflation of these principles allows us to support both meritocracy and the market so that the futility of our own efforts does not come fully into view. These knots, these wounds, these impossibilities do not exist only in the microstructures of our psyche, nor do they exist only in the actuality of macrostructures. Rather, these impossibilities constitute both. Micro and macro structures are reifications that we employ to grasp and not grasp that the whole is riven. Thank you. That's what I brought today.
Thank you, Naeem. I had planned to comment on, things after they were said, but I think I won't. Also, there's a child, a baby crying here, which I think their body know what's happening. Thank you, Nate. So I will give the floor to Samuel. So just to introduce Samuel to us, Samuel is currently a researcher at the Interdisciplinary Laboratory, Matters of Activity, Image, Space, Material at the Humboldt University in Berlin. His research areas comprise political philosophy, structuralism and post-structuralism, theoretical psychoanalysis, and the critique of political economy. Do note that he brings it all together, so that's quite impressive. His recent publications include the book The Capitalist Unconscious and The Labor of Enjoyment, as well as the essay collection edited together with Andrea Zevnik, who will be speaking on Friday and is here with us today, Jacques Lacan, Between Psychoanalysis and Politics. On a side note, Samuel is, those persons you read and you think, this kind of brain, this certainly exists in a different plane. So you craft a very careful email for the invitation and you receive a reply half an hour afterwards saying, sure, very enthusiastically, and gets you thinking, maybe we did the right decision in staying in academia. So Samuel, thank you for being here with us today, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Paulo, for this these very generous words, and for having me here, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure, yes. So I will also move to the presentation, and I must say that I'm very relieved also that there have been a lot of intersections with Narin's talk. So and I would begin by proposing a response to the panel title Capital Love. So my answer would be capital hate. Hatred as a fundamental systemic affect, inseparable from the logic of competition, for sure. This imposed paradigm of capitalist social bond, of our social being or of our being with. This problem found a major expression in Freud's work under various names: aggressivity, the death drive, the drive of mastery, masochism, and so on. On a fundamental systemic level, it was addressed in the already mentioned discussion of primitive accumulation and colonialism in Marx's Capital, where Marx insists that a theory of value must take into account the role of systemic violence in the production of surplus value. So valorization is a violent act, and extraction of value ultimately implies destruction of the living, the social, and the environmental. Extraction, being a violent act, is therefore an act of hate, or inversely, hate is an affect signaling that a surplus is being extracted. Before moving to the role of hate and other negative antisocial affects in capitalism, I would like to return to Kant, not so much for affirming his position in political philosophy, but in order to pinpoint a displacement in an essential feature of capitalist ideology, the notion of progress. In the conflict of faculties, Kant refers to the French Revolution as an event that confirms the existence and the continuity of historical progress towards the better, zum Besseren in the German original. So humanity is, so Kant's wager, in the process of improvement, and the French Revolution presumably demonstrates this. Now, the actual proof lies for Kant less in the political event itself. He finds it in the affect that this event triggers in its audience, the enthusiasm. The audience assumes an ambiguous limit position, which is neither inside nor outside the historical turmoil and therefore history. Neither a position of absolute neutrality, since the observer is affected, nor a position of immersion, since Kant explicitly states that the event works as a source of enthusiasm only when there is an interval, spacing, or divergence between the observer and the eventful situation. In other words, there is mediation, both geographical. Kant observes the events from Prussia, and temporal. Enthusiasm emerges when the information about the event has been transmitted, whereby this transmission is also filtering the violent aspects, neutralizing their effective power, which, as Kant explicitly notes, would give rise to other, less favorable effects. We could think of anxiety, for instance. I'm, of course, mentioning Kant because this position of affected observer is most problematic. The Kantian observer is passive, and in a way it exemplifies the position of part of contemporary European left, which observes insurrections in other parts of the globe and then draws melancholic surplus enjoyment from their failure. At the same time, the fantasy of perpetual progress, because this is what it ultimately is, a fantasy, underwent a double change, or rather, progress towards the better has been replaced with a fantasy of uninterrupted economic growth, an ahistorical or post-historical version of progress. Furthermore, the establishment of capitalism as a global order is characterized by progress towards the worse, worsening, negative progress associated with something that we may perhaps call implosion of history. In these catastrophic times, we constantly hear the old saying by Frederick Jameson that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. While in the 1990s, one could still pretend that two distinct, even opposite ends were at stake in this formula. Today, it seems impossible to imagine any other end of the world than in the guise of the climate breakdown induced by the crisis-ridden capitalism accompanied by the conditions for a global civil war. The climate breakdown stands for some kind of realization of capitalism in the guise of destabilization or dismantling of environmental orders and equilibriums. And I don't need to recall, this development is the logical flip side of the Cartesian ideal of the mastering of nature, an ideal that unites modern science and capitalist economy. Of course, it would be wrong to erase the distinction between capitalism and the unfolding environmental catastrophe, but this conclusion thus seems to follow from the attempts of naturalization of human greed from the ideological claim that capitalism is the socio-economic system that corresponds best to the presumable natural human inclination to egoism. In this respect, seeing in capitalism the ultimate natural catastrophe would repeat the error of what Marx called vulgar economics, but in reverse. So, you know, this famous passage from German ideology where Marx says that the bourgeois economists see in capitalist institutions, so to speak, institutions of nature, whereas everything that is not capitalist institution, for instance, feudal institutions, it is considered as anti-natural. If under today's circumstances, the end of the world remains inseparable from the end of capitalism, then this union of both ends reflects the full scale of systemic resistance against structural change, and, to repeat, stands for the ultimate negative attempt of capitalism's continuous self-naturalization. making of the climate breakdown a catastrophic component of human nature and capitalism indistinguishable from this catastrophe. So to be sure, to speak about the catastrophic realization of capitalism is not the same as its naturalization. The capitalist naturalism ignores that environmental catastrophe as such is a gradual surplus product, the flip side of growth-oriented economy and of the self-valorization of capital. And with Lacan, one could say that the climate collapse is a response of the real to the economic fantasy of continuous growth. And from the viewpoint of today's populists, from this viewpoint, today's populists are the most persistent and most consequent advocates of capitalist naturalism, since on the background of the old hypothesis regarding the natural inclination of human beings to greed, egoism, anti-sociality, they embrace the necessity of undoing environmental legislation in order to sustain the capital's drive of self-valorization. And it is crucial that Marx speaks of capital as drive, Trieb, which brings him in direct proximity with Freud. And one could say that this is, in a way, Marx's affect theory, the drive of capital as a systemic force, a systemic affect. So in capitalist naturalism of today, environmental policies are considered counter-natural, just as theories of gender, same-sex marriage, women's rights, and so on. Populism thus stands for an openly aggressive attempt to return to the natural man, and I'm deliberately gendering here. A tendency in which contemporary right strives to re-centralize politics to masculinity that does no longer make any effort to conceal its increasing toxification. So the paradox of our contemporary catastrophe capitalism consists in the fact that this system can only continue under the condition that it imposes its own end as the end of the world, making its own ending indistinguishable from the climate breakdown. I say imposes because I would like to draw attention to compulsion, to the compulsive and violently sustained identity between both ends, so the end of capitalism and the end of humanity, and basically the end of life in a way. So it is the capitalist system overtly running amok today. It should also not be surprising that the postmodern fantasies of the end of the world are now replaced by the fantasies of perpetuation of capitalism beyond the climate catastrophe, fictionalizations of possible conversions of the ultimate environmental limit of capitalism into yet another barrier that simply needs to be overcome by means of technology. So the logical flip side of contemporary disaster capitalism is, on the one hand, sci-fi capitalism driven by fantasies of escape, survival of capitalism as a space project, and on the other hand, post-apocalyptic Mad Max capitalism. No surprise that a techno-capitalist such as Elon Musk ends up investing both in space travel and in development of armored vehicles such as Tesla. And Tesla, I mean, we have to imagine what social condition is this tank made for. Clearly, I mean, it's very close to a Mad Max scenario. As discussions have evolved around populism, one particular notion has undergone a renaissance: resentment or a ressentiment. Along with this affect, the problem of the antisocial fully enters the picture. The antisocial can here be understood in three different manners. Its most obvious meaning is the negation of the social, so dismantling the bonds that hold society together. The second concerns what is at stake in the populist mobilization of resentment, the turn away from structural contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, their mystification through aggressive politics of spectacle, the fabrication of scapegoats and conspiracy theories, barely accounting for the actual causes of the present social condition. And the third meaning of anti-sociality relates to the appearance according to which whatever operates as antisocial disrupts the otherwise uncorrupted social relations and otherwise regulated, harmonious economic order. Again, this Hayekian hypothesis that has been evoked. This third meaning overlooks that resentment is a systemically induced affective economy, and a structural view allows us to understand resentment not as an individual affect, but as a bodily manifestation of systemic resistance, a sort of individuation of systemic hate. When I'm reaching the time to conclude, please give me a signal.
You're perfectly on time, so no worry. But I will give you a signal if it happens.
Okay, thank you. So, because the populist vision of the people rests on the rejection of enemy figures and menacing others, their attempt in constructing a unified people's body is underpinned by aggressivity. In this scenario, the people comes down to a bifurcated mass which directs its resentment both outwards and inwards, combining rejection of cultural, racialized, and sexual others with economic competition. In the end, the ideal people of right-wing populism is an autoaggressive mass tied together by negative affects and embedded in a gradual process of self-dissolution. Despite claiming otherwise, right-wing populism is a politics that is ultimately geared to dismantling the people. And in doing so, it perpetuates the neoliberal antisocial contract and strives for a social bond which is ultimately an unbond, a paradoxical antisocial social bond grounded on destructive impulses and actively working on dissolving the social. When discussing about political affects, one can hardly avoid the notion of the drive, which, to repeat, unites Marx and Freud. With the drive, the notion of surplus object enters the picture. Surplus value in Marx, of course, and what Lacan called surplus enjoyment. This surplus object is characterized by the fact that it contains something like movement and that it intertwines satisfaction and dissatisfaction. For instance, surplus value is value that grows. That's why movement. This feature is expressed as this feature of dynamics in the object and the intertwining of satisfaction and dissatisfaction that comes along with it. So this feature is expressed in the double meaning of the French term plus, surplus, which, depending on the context, can mean more and no more. That's why Lacan was also playing whenever he said plus de jouir, more enjoyment or no more enjoyment. It means both. So the affect of resentment exemplifies a libidinal economy in which the lack of enjoyment and surplus enjoyment, dissatisfaction and satisfaction are fused together, turning the subject's powerlessness or impotency into a source of surplus enjoyment. It is hardly surprising that such libidinal economy is marked above all by aggressivity towards others. As Eric Fassin argues, resentment rests on the idea that the other enjoys it instead of me, depriving me of my enjoyment. Such resentment is not simply a source of enjoyment, but ultimately exemplifies precisely what Lacan called plus de jouir. how it's spelled, like plus. So one could say that the subject of resentment is bribed, and the currency with which it is bribed is precisely surplus enjoyment. His hate is individualized capitalist hatred of sociality, and populism is basically allowing certain aspects of society to unleash their aggressivity and therefore gain a certain profit a pleasurable profit, this surplus enjoyment. So that's why I'm talking about bribing. So capital is organized hate, which demonstrates that the social was never guaranteed and should never be taken for granted. And I would like to conclude with Freud's closing lines from his Civilization and its Discontent, with a comment on the political situation on the 1930s, the rise of National Socialism, the proliferation of anti-Semitism, and the immediate aftermath of economic breakdown of 1922. He reads this as an expression of the predominance of the death drive against eros, anti-sociality against sociality, and concludes. So here's a longer quote from Freud. The fateful question for the human species seems to me to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human drive of aggression and self-destruction. It may be that in this respect, precisely, the present time deserves a special interest. Men have gained control over the forces of nature to such an extent that with their help, they would have no difficulty in exterminating one another to the last man. They know this, and hence comes a large part of their current unrest, their unhappiness, and their mood of anxiety. And now it is to be expected that the other of the two heavenly powers, eternal Eros, will make an effort to assert himself in the struggle with his equally immortal adversary. But who can foresee with what success and with what result? End of quote. So just a short comment, if I may, to this quote. So in the Freudian scenario, humans are figures in the eternal struggle between eros and the death drive, divided between the tendency of sustaining social bonds and the tendency to dismantle them. One has to pick sides in this conflict, and one could speak here of the Freudian imperative, in which everything turns around the question of inventing the future, inventing sociality. Freud does not simply preach here some naive politics of love or some libidinal fusionism or organic social unity or anything in this kind. Eros stands for sublimation, which is a form of effective labor in which difference would no longer be a source of competitiveness and a source for generation of resentment, hence not a source or a driving force of aggressivity. Psychoanalysis is a social bond with underlining social, precisely because it refuses to accept hell as something that is here to stay until the end of life and even be called life. Thank you. And sorry for being a bit over the time.
No problem. Thank you so much, Samuel. So we have we'll start the Q&A section. So feel all free to send your questions in Portuguese or English through the chat on Zoom or on YouTube, and we'll transmit them to the speakers or read them out loud just so they stay registered for people watching afterwards. So we have one question from João Paulo Rossati, to Samuel, and then I might, if nothing interject, I might interject myself. So Samuel, I think you can read the question in the chat if you. But I'll just read it out loud so people watching afterwards have access to the question as well. So in your book, The Capitalist Unconscious, you show how a capitalist discourse creates a subjectivist mode of be yourself, where there is no other way to be yourself. There is no alternative and no other libidinal economy. How do you think that neoliberalism ideological fantasy intensifies this process of interpolation and subjectivation to extract surplus value and plus de jouir? And I would also add maybe a provocation to both Naim and Samo. And so it's an invitation for maybe you to engage each other's talk, because it seems to me that there's a lot in common, but either in different vocabularies or in different directions. So I'll just pinpoint 3 things that came to mind for you to react if you feel like reacting. On the one hand, one is maybe the tension, proximity, or difference between what Naim called the asocial sociability as the social form of capital. So the intimate touching of our labors but not of ourselves. And on the other hand, the unsocial bound of capitalism and how capitalism destroys the social bound. So I'm not sure if we're talking about the same thing here. So maybe you could react to each other's formulation of the social side or unsocial side of capitalism. And maybe on the same vein, the tension between capital as something that takes us beyond the laws of nature, as Naim said, and capitalism as facing the limits of nature and trying to turn it into an obstacle, as Samo said. So again, different formulations. And last but not least, on the one hand, Marx titling his magnum opus Capital and leaving the primitive accumulation to the end, on the one hand, as Naim said, and Samo foregrounding your speech, talk to us with the idea that valorization is violence, and where there is surplus value, there is violence, as shown in the primitive accumulation discussion. So maybe this difference speaks to the difference between riven love and hate, or maybe you could, so these invitations for reactions. And once again, thank you very much for your presentations. Oh, right, I should say who starts, right? So I forget. Samo, maybe you can begin since your microphone is open.
That was not. I can also switch it off and Naim begins.
Okay, so Naim, maybe you can get it started. So Sam will get some, get some breathing after his talk.
Yes. So, I mean, reading a prepared script is a lot easier sometimes. I guess if I compare our 2 talks, I am struck by one similarity and then mainly by the differences in our posture. The similarity seems to me that we both end on the same note, which is that difference can be seen as, I'm interpreting here, Samo, so please correct me, yeah? We both might agree that difference is something that can be seen as a positive influence in the encounter. Difference can be seen as a resource for everybody in the encounter. My interpretation of Samo's talk was that we were both trying to reinterpret difference so that it moves away from hatred and from competitions. Yeah, so I think that's where the similarity is. But mostly I was struck by the differences. The capitalism / capital that Samo described in his talk is on the one hand familiar to me because I hear it from my colleagues and I hear it from my students, and yet it is unfamiliar to me because this is not what I see in Marx. And my emphasis on saying that, look, the primitive violence comes at the end of capital and not at the beginning, because Marx is trying to do something which is internal to capitalism itself. He's trying to show us that there's a logic inside of capitalism that goes beyond capitalism. That's why I think he starts with the commodity instead of the violence at the end. And I think probably the fundamental disagreement is Samuel's claim that valorization is violence. That's kind of not what I interpret classical political economy from Smith and Ricardo all the way to Marx to be saying, that valorization is part of violence. That's the theory of exploitation, yes. But valorization is also a relationship with nature in which the point of capital is to transform the laws of nature. So I think we have a different view of one, Marx, and two, labor theory of value, and three, what the function of capitalism is vis-a-vis getting to the future. How about that? Non-scripted response? Can I stop there?
Yes, thanks, Naeem. So yeah.
I would then take these three notions: anti-sociality, nature, and value / violence, and also maybe return to Marx's Capital volume, well, not only volume 1, to his entire project of critique of political economy. I think if we take a few samples from this vast oeuvre, which would take several lifetimes to chew on, then I think there is this moment that emerges over and over again, that Marx addresses a certain, well, not only hostility of capital, but also that ultimately a certain anti-sociality is built in the capitalist organization of production, of social life, of relation to nature, of history, and I think one point where this becomes evident is whenever he speaks about the drive of capital and how this drive functions in difference to other similar phenomena from pre-capitalist modes of production. You know, for instance, he's talking about the miser and refers to Aristotle, who already discovered this phenomenon of money breeding money. And the problem of money breeding money is, you know, for Aristotle, a scandal, because it's antisocial money. It's money that is not used for some sort of social relationality, but is inverted into itself. So it sustains a social relation to itself and excludes social relation between human beings, or subjects them to exploitation, as you said, Naeem. Another moment where there is anti-sociality, like very explicitly spelled out, is when Marx talks about production, capitalist production, as being ultimately production for the sake of production. So not for the sake of improving life, progress, making human progress towards the better, as Kant would say, but to replace every idea of progress or improvement of life, satisfaction of needs, care of for the bodies that compose society and so on. So dismantling all these potentials of sociality, of value, with production for the sake of production. So production for the sake of augmentation of value, which is an antisocial activity par excellence. And I think, you know, the current situation of capitalism is really giving extra weight to these small bits and pieces from Marx's Capital. And basically, the way I read this work is, yeah, it's a work on the anti-sociality that characterizes modernity. But I do agree. I mean, there are problems that are tied to value, to commodity form, and that all circulate around the abstraction that is at stake in them. And this is not something that is specifically capitalist, of course not. But what capitalism does, it unleashes the creative potential of fictions. But to the extent that this becomes, as you know, a machinery that spins in the air and that dismantles everything that is there in order to convert, you know, nature, human bodies, animal bodies, plants, you name it, into this abstract mass that can join capital, that can make value grow, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying, sorry, I'm being a bit too long. I'm not saying, you know, that this is a pre-programmed catastrophe in capitalism. That's why I was saying that today the ultimate way of naturalizing capitalism is saying, well, it's been always there. You know, the environmental catastrophe is in capitalism itself. It just had to come to this point. I don't think it's this development was pre-programmed or necessary or kind of perverted teleology of capitalism, but we're here now. And what it does demonstrate is that capitalism is not a social, but an antisocial or asocial mode of production.
Okay, thank you, Samu. We have a couple of new questions coming, so I'm going to start organizing them. We have a blog on, you know, solutions and way outs, which might be a good moment to get them before we entangle ourselves some more. So Haileni Abdila asks you, Samu. So we have two for Samu, one for Naim. Given that for Lacan, the surplus enjoyment is expressed through resentment and aggression, how can the left manage to tap into the fantasy of the people when it is usually associated with the underdog and presents a castrated form of discourse of being mindful to others and to the planet, thus eliminating our freedom, PC culture, cancel culture? Moreover, can psychoanalysis provide a way to understand the subject as a split subject, which is not necessarily driven by aggression and resentment? So both on the Puritanism of the left and on the split subject as an alternative. For Alice Maria dos Santos Gomes, for Samu as well, asks, how can the stage of neoliberalism and the possible consequences of the pandemic contribute to accelerate the end of the world as we know, and consequently the end of capitalism? Okay, and I also have a question to Naim on that block by Marcelo Capucci. He asks, what would be, in your opinion, an alternative to meritocracy as plutocracy? Perhaps a plural understanding of merit, which considers merit on a collective and not purely individual basis, alongside mutual and cooperative form of social reproduction, which create greater parity in wealth, opportunity, care, and provision. Are they clear? So, yeah, now I'm torn. Naim, can I, when there's 3 people, it's easier to distribute. So Naim, maybe you can get us started?
Yeah, so this is an easy answer for me, you know, because I could just tell you what I believe. I would just throw out meritocracy. I mean, when I said in the talk, I could claim that there is no such thing as deservingness. That's, I mean, that's I think I believed that since I was 4 years old. There's nothing in meritocracy that I find appealing. It's still highly competitive. It's still incredibly envy generating. It's still some version of this of war against all against all. So out with meritocracy is my claim. And you know, I am actually moved by the claim that is attributed to Marx, but actually I learned that he took from somebody else. The one that says from those according to their abilities to those according to their needs. That's, you know, that's old-fashioned maybe, but it moves me. Ilan Kapoor was talking on Monday about how the left has to grab its desire. And I thought, I know how I can do that for myself. I can embrace this as a principle without feeling that I'm innocent or romantic in any way. Because I've gone through all the other principles and thought to myself, no, not the market principle, not the meritocratic principle, not any of these principles. Here's the one that actually my body lines up with and says, yes, please, this one.
Thank you, Naim.
I will try to combine the answers, but yeah, no, I mean, psychoanalysis has a very well, not a very flattering theory of the subject. I guess we can agree on that, with, you know, accent on alienation, on split, on castration, and so on. But I mean, the subject of resentment is already castrated. It is castrated subject. It's a subject who experiences the impotency of its social placement, and then assumes for, well, figures of the other, that they are having access to enjoyment that he or her doesn't, or is castrated for. You know, like yesterday, for instance, Rodrigo was recalling this prejudice towards the Greek that has been circulating around Europe during the debt crisis. You know, the lazy, the enjoying Greeks. You know, they no wonder that they have this economic mess, because they have been living beyond their means. So this is like the typical sentence that is used for, you know, saying you are enjoying, you are a subject of enjoyment, whereas we are abstinent. And funnily enough, this has echo in Marx's Capital, when he criticizes political economy for its abstinent theory of the capitalist, also at the beginning of the primitive accumulation chapter. It's you know, it's the embryonal version of what German taxpayer would think about Greek, the Greek non-taxpayer, presumably, during the crisis. That the rich are rich because they abstain from enjoyment and therefore create surplus enjoyment. And the poor are poor because they enjoyed beyond their means. Yeah, I mean, to get back to the psychoanalytic theory of the subject, I think its main value is that it conceives the subject in its own way as a site of a struggle. So it's a localization of a structural tension, of a structural conflict. And in this way, actually, it comes very close to Marx, to the figure of the proletariat as one possible figure of a split subject, a terrain where class struggle, as you know, the paradigm of a structural contradiction, is exemplified. And it's not the only one. I mean, the chapter on colonialism is pointing in the direction that anti-colonial theory has gone and added the colonized subject as another figure of this split subjectivity in the body and the mind of which a structural conflict is sharpened out. And we could continue lining up these figures that join together. So I think it's more, again, a question of constructing political subjectivity that is a relation, that is fundamentally a relation to others. And this is, again, a question of solidarization and solidification in emancipatory struggles that point towards a common ground rather than being, again, differentiated and embedded in this competitive logics that is the filter through which capitalism manages to neutralize every struggle for emancipation. Sorry, just very quick to the second question. I didn't even come to that. Sorry.
Go ahead.
How can this stage of neoliberalism and the possible consequences of the pandemic contribute to accelerate the end of the world as we know, and consequently the end of capitalism? I'm on the pessimist side. I think the pandemic now is really showing us that we are dealing with what Deleuze called society of control, but with a 2.0. So the enforcement of digital capitalism is the result of the pandemic. And it's interesting to observe how 1 year ago everyone was saying, this was the proof we can make this system, bring this system to a halt. The CO2 emissions are falling dramatically, and 1 year later they're worse than ever. So actually, this pandemic is making capitalism worse than ever, and it makes perfect sense because capitalism gets enforced by crisis. I mean, this is something that we know from the past, so it's nothing new, unfortunately.
Thank you, Samuel. So I have collected some more questions and I keep organizing them in a way. So I have a couple of questions actually from Jimmy Clause, fellow organizer and professor at the department. One is for Naim and one's for both. And since it's getting a reaction for both, let me try to separate this one. So first, Naim, the question is, the first section of your talk recalled for me Chakrabarty's article published in the journal Millennium, Planetary Crisis and the Difficulty of Being Modern, where Chakrabarty argues about the uneven and even unequal effects of environmental planetary crisis for the global south. that the possibility is that a so-called slum dweller in Mumbai may benefit much more from having a polluting air conditioner and so on. How do you think the possible difference between capital and capitalism in terms of the slum dweller who can finally sleep restfully at night because of a polluting air conditioner? And then there's a provocation or a question for both Naeem and Samuel that says, in terms of your talks, how would you situate what might be called first world capitalism's moment of conscience in the 1970s, when new Malthusian anxieties arose and the book The Limits of Growth became a bestseller? For Naeem, thinking the limits of growth in terms of modernization discourse, and for Samuel, thinking the limits of growth in terms of the end of capital as the end of the world. Yes? Does that make?
Thank you, Jimmy, for that question, difficult question. I'd love to read this article first before I say anything. I have a slightly different story that Coca-Cola is supposed to be bad, and yet people in my mother's village drink Coca-Cola, and it turns out that it's better for them to drink Coca-Cola than the water, the local water, which has been polluted. So maybe this is a similar story. I don't know if that's a similar story or not, but I think sometimes you have to have the courage to say, I don't know how to answer this question. So I actually don't know how to answer that question. Sometimes I just don't answer questions, but this one I actually don't know how to answer. And actually the second part also I'm not sure I get. Let me see if I can wrap it around a thought that I had about Samo's talk as well. What I think is missing from an appreciation of Marx's book Capital and his corpus of work. And, we don't have to talk about Marx, but it's just a way of reflecting on life, I suppose, is to say that what, succinctly put, what's missing in the usual analysis of Marx is the influence of Hegel. That's the quickest way to say it. But here's a different way to say the same thing, which is Marx's attitude towards capitalism is a function of what he compares it to. And so there can be no doubt that he is antagonistic towards capitalism when he's inside it, when his analytic work is inside it. But when he's doing his historical work, there's no doubt that he thinks it's better than feudalism, that he thinks it's better than hunting and gathering societies. I think his theory of history has to be accessed as well, and his theory of history is very much in lines with the Hegelian theory of history. So what I find frustrating with a lot of the people who appropriate Marx and Marxism today is the disappearance of this element. I'll give you an example. When some of my students ask me, what can I read that really is the best appreciation of capitalism, I don't ask them to read Hayek or Milton Friedman. I say, go straight to Marx, the greatest appreciator of what capitalism is, of its progressive characteristics, of its capacity to emancipate human beings, is Marx himself. When he is taking his notes, when he is pretending to be Hegel himself. Now, of course, he inverts all of that at some point, but there's too much of Marx that's actually appreciating capitalism for me to ignore that. So, Jimmy, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I thought I would wrap that around a little bit in order to say something, except for the fact that I don't know how to answer this question.
Thanks, Naeem. For both versions of honesty, right? Like the I don't know, and then still I have something. Samuel.
Yeah, I think. I would like to connect actually and express my affirmationist position towards what Naeem just said. I am also always for affirming Hegel in Marx, and whenever there is a possibility to bring the the old fellow in the game, I'm absolutely enthused, because I think Hegel is what we need. He basically, well, if you ask me, not only no Marx without Hegel, I would also say no Freud without Hegel. This is where the theory of the subject that unites Marx and Freud is born in Hegel's dialectics, or in Hegel's phenomenology. So I agree also with this appreciation of Marx, of capitalism, but I think at the same time, well, I mean, Marx is antagonized by capitalism. Of course, there is a certain improvement of the human condition compared to feudalism and so on, but I mean, I was listening to a talk by my Slovenian chief, Slavoj Žižek, the other day, who was also saying, like, look what capitalism did, this entire emancipation that took place, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, abolition of slavery, and then progressive emancipation of former colonies. I think this happened in spite of capitalism, not because of capitalism. I think this is, I mean, there are aspects of progress that shouldn't be credited to capitalism only because they took place in capitalism. So I think, the fact that the last chapter of first volume of Capital then addresses the link between violence and value must be taken really, like, seriously. And this is where also I think Marx's appreciation for capitalism turns very sour.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Samuel. So I have one more block of questions, which I have arranged because it speaks initially, I think, to the beginning of your conversation. I mean, the conversation I asked you to have in the beginning between possible differences and proximities, but also ties it maybe to your stories. So 3 questions. One from Hannah, and are you hearing a very loud sound? Yeah, right. So it'll last 15 capitalism, right? So from Hannah, she asks, I think both. Is there not also a freedom within antisocial sociality? In some ways, this frees us from previous descriptive hierarchy. So bluntly, is there not also freedom in a social sociality? From Bruno Gastal, to you, Samuel. Wouldn't this view of capitalism and its inherently antisocial be more compatible with a view such as that of Polanyi, or even of anthropologists like Lévi-Strauss, than with Marx? Marx still saw the progressive potential of capitalism in that it gathered workers in the factory, thus pointing the way towards a classless society, which I think are points you've had addressed in the responses you just gave. But maybe we could tie those 2 questions to a question João Marcelo asked both. Roughly speaking, Samo and Naim were talking about two sides of the same coin. Naim once wrote on the relevance of biographies. Would the two of you be able to point to a personal experience or story that might have led to these complementary but perhaps inverted viewpoints on the antisocial? Yes, that's okay. Maybe we can start with Samo this time, just so you know, to invert a little bit.
But I would protest.
Please do.
I think I'm talking too much, so please, let's keep the balance.
You know, I cannot fend off protests. So if you also protest, Naim, I won't know what to do, which might be fun.
Well, yeah, because you, Pauline, you are very creative when you don't know what to do. But I won't do that to you at this particular moment. I think Hannah's question is addressed to Samo because, you know, truth be it that Hannah and I work together a lot. So I won't answer that one. I'll leave that one for Samo. But the biographical question is fun. So I'll indulge in that one just for a minute. Let's see. My four grandparents, I only knew one of them, but my four grandparents were all village dwellers. They lived in villages about 10 miles from each other, the two sets of grandparents. Neither village at that point had electricity, running water, bathrooms, none of that. Yeah, okay. And so that's part one of the biography. Yeah? I remember being in my mother's village much later when there was electricity and some water, even though no sanitation per se, and watching, I had a camera and I was taking pictures of the village, you know, and my cousins would say to me, young cousins would say to me, why are you taking pictures of the village? You know, you're taking pictures of the stupidest, silliest things in the village. And I turned to them and I said, listen, you know, one day, all you will have left of this village are my photographs. So that's part two of the biography. Part three of the biography is I remember taking that camera and going out into the rice field and watching the transfer of paddy. You know, the transfer of paddy is incredibly labor-intensive work. Yeah, you have to take paddy's about like 6-7 inches, and you have to take it from one part of the ground and put it into another part of the ground which has been flooded. Okay, now this is manual work, and I saw this man. He must have been only 10 or 15 years older than me, and I watched him do this for 15, 20, 30 minutes. And my job was simply to photograph him. But then, of course, it's back-breaking work. Yeah, so there was something wrong about my photography at that particular moment. I felt ashamed a little bit. So that's the third part of the story. I'll give one more part of the story and then I'll stop. Yeah, I remember going back to my mother's village when one of my sons was born, Kamal was born, and taking him back to the village, and my cousins, who were 15 and 16 and 17, they were very proud to make us dinner in the village, right? But in order to do so, they had to go collect dung patties to heat up a fire in order to make us our meal, and they weren't able to collect enough of the dung patties. Yeah, so I turned to my uncle and I said, "How come you haven't bought them a gas stove?" What's wrong with you? They should have a gas stove, not just so I can have a meal, but so they don't have to do all this work just to start up the fire. Now, so those are the stories from which I'm thinking to myself that whether it's capitalism or capital, it's got a lot more work to do. Yeah. I don't want to romanticize their lives, even though I captured the pictures. You know, I have the pictures. I did romanticize their lives. There's something about it that calls us, yeah, that the village life. But on the other hand, I am not volunteering to transfer the patty. Let me be in front of the camera instead of in front of the process that has to transfer the rice patty. So I'll stop there. Good question, João. Right up my alley.
Thank you, Nate. And good pronunciation of the, the João. Lots of practice there. Old friend. Samu.
Yes. So the question of freedom. I mean, of course there is freedom within capitalist anti-sociality, but the problem is also, I mean, that or that would be my spontaneous reflex when I hear the word freedom, that it's on the one hand filtered through that the paradigm of freedom under capitalism is freedom of the market, and all other freedoms are channeled or filtered through the freedom of the market as the paradigm of freedom. I mean, I mentioned Kant's fascination with the French Revolution, and their freedom is, as we all know, in a sort of Borromean knot. Freedom, equality, and a very problematic term, fraternity, which of course has to be replaced with something else for obvious reasons, that it connotes, well, fraternity. But maybe solidarity would be one possible signifier that could replace it. And this third term is affective. It's kind of addresses the issue of a social affect, of an affect that will not unbind or that will not dismantle, that will not, be an offspring of aggressivity, but will bind, will counter aggressivity. So again, also as in Freud's conflict between Eros and Thanatos. So I would say freedom in the knot, not freedom detached from the other two political signifiers, is what is crucial. So the interesting part, I would say, is not freedom, which doesn't mean that I want to downplay freedom, but I think this is what the greatest achievement of liberalism and neoliberalism is. It turned freedom into a fetish, and dissolved the political knot that we need in order to have a sociality that in which the antisocial will not proliferate. There was one question that I can't find in the chat anymore, but I think it was on Polanyi.
I can, yeah, it was sent on YouTube, which is why you're not finding it on the chat. But I can repeat it, or even post it on the chat and send it to you, so you can see it as I reread it.
Maybe just very briefly about the personal experience that led me to my viewpoint on the social and antisocial. I mean, that's a bit, it's not up my alley. So it's kind of catching me unprepared. I carry all possible theory munition with me, but the personal is never present. So I must apologize if I don't go and search into my personal history, but it definitely has to do with my upbringing in a workers' family. Okay, so the view of capitalism as inherently anti-social. Yes, well, yes, of course, but again, it's a question. I mean, what we want to do with Marx, and he, of course, was as a good Hegelian, to get back to our man. As a good Hegelian, he didn't only think capitalism in relation to the look backwards in history, but also in relation to, well, the rotten foundations that are here and now, and the self-overcoming. Well, I mean, if spirit in history is the movement of the spirit's self-overcoming, then Marx's point was precisely to detect the points in which the system is pointing towards itself in the present, and not in the sense of self-reproduction, converting limits into barriers, as he says of capital, the movement of capital, but also in where the system itself produces symptoms. And the proletariat was such a symptom, was such a social symptom, which is, of course, perfectly integrated in the overall logic of capital, but at the same time opens up this perpetuum mobile and allows to start also comparing capitalism forwards, not only backwards. So, which could be also linked to this question of freedom. So yes, capitalism brought freedom, but how do we have to handle this precarious and fragile present?
Thank you very much, Samu. So I have here two more questions, which I think are the last I received for the both of you. But there's maybe further question. There's thank you for transforming the heavy topics into light conversation, easy to process and understand. So a big, a shout out from Alice to the two speakers, which I think is really on point. So we have two questions which are quite broad. So I think they have the advantage of allowing you to approach it in different ways and maybe wrap up thoughts that you that are circling around. One, it's about the state of discussions, and the other about love. So Rafael Pedroso asks, he asks Samuel, but I'm going to take liberty to direct it to both of you because I think Naim has something to say here as well. So as you mentioned, the question of the end of the world, the end of capital appears. I am curious to know more about how do you see the theoretical political landscape that emerges when facing the ecological crisis and capitalist crisis. In particular, the proliferation of said new materialisms, affirmations of multiplicity and destabilizations on the other, a whole discussion of what materialism ought to mean in the first place, entertaining, among other things, a certain materialism without matter. So what does that tension mean for Marxist critique and political praxis, in your opinion? Was the description of the field of ecology and capitalist crisis clear? Because I stuttered. Okay, yes, no, kind of. Okay, thanks, Rafael. Kind of? Okay. So the other question is from Esidio de Bustamante, to both speakers. I will read it, but I will post it on the chat as well because it comes from the YouTube, so you're not seeing it. Esidio, I'm just gonna this. Yeah. So on the idea of love, Sorokin, 1954 says, quote, "The time has come for humanity not only to begin to understand the nature, forms, and how and why of love, but also to endeavor to design a more efficient techniques of its production." End quote. This is very much aligned with Kenneth Boulding's The Economy of Love and Fear of 1976. Could it be the case that we have not been focusing enough on narratives of love as ways of alleviating human suffering and other forms of relating that counter capitalistic exploitation? Take, for instance, the subsistence perspective of Maria Mies and Veronica Benhold Thompson, when they weave another form of relating to nature and making a living from it, aligned with an ecofeminist perspective. How would you view this? These? Yes? Okay. So I'm third time's a charm, right? So Samu, maybe we can start with you this time.
Okay.
I'm persistent.
Okay. I can try to castrate my ability of speech this time.
No need.
But yes, I mean this is really good question, because this overproduction of materialisms in the present is kind of symptomatic, and it is also yes, showing in a way that we're dealing here also with a race to the bottom, because in my opinion, I think Marx's materialism, if materialism is now something that one has to prove, in order to be, engaging with crisis-driven developments in a pertinent manner, I would say Marx's materialism is still the best offer in town. Also because it is materialism without matter. As a matter of fact, I mean, Marx says it himself, that the materialist lessons are to be sought in the misty realms of religion, and dragging his Hegelian luggage along with it. It's that made him a good materialist, and I mean, matter itself in modernity is deprived of qualities. It's an abstraction. So matter itself is matterless in a way. And that's why Marx can integrate an abstraction such as value into materialist thinking and show that, when commodities stand on their heads, that is a materialist issue, not putting them back on their feet and they will be just objects that satisfy human needs. The main problem of materialism is immaterial in its nature. Or the object of materialism is not matter in this naive stuff, here and now I can touch it, it's warm and cold, and so on.
Thank you, Samu. Double thank you. Naim?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the relationship between the ecological crisis and capitalism real quick, and then I'll touch on the issue of love. I'm looking at the clock as well. Let's see. The book there's a book that turned my view of the relationship between capitalism and the ecological crisis around completely. And that was the prize. I'm forgetting the guy's name, but he's an apologist for the oil companies. And the prize is an 860-page book about the history of oil. And sometimes, you know, the writing can be better than the author. That happens, right? So this is a tremendous book because by the time you finish reading this book, it becomes incredibly obvious. Two things become incredibly obvious. One is that the 20th century is a century that revolves around the commodity oil, that wars have been fought. World War I, World War II were about oil. Now, you may want to believe this or you may not want to believe this. That's not really the point. The point is that this guy is not even trying to make these claims, and yet he's making, the book itself is making these claims. But the most important claim this fellow is making in this book called The Prize is that it's the consumption of oil that is internalized to the circuits of capital, and therefore the ecological crisis is in fact a product of capitalism. Yeah, I mean, he's not even trying to make this claim, but if you read this book, there's no way out from this claim. It's just written in plain Portuguese or English. I'm sure the book has been translated. So to summarize on this issue for me, I get, you know, frustration is the mark of the day, I guess, for me. I get frustrated with students and colleagues who champion the causes of the environment and the ecological. And I say to them, come on, don't you get it? This crisis is the result of, you cannot address the ecological issues without addressing capitalism. That's the heart of it. Come on. Let's get with the program here. So that's my comment on that. Maybe it does or doesn't address the question that's being asked, but there you go. Okay. Now, on this issue of love as a means of alleviating human suffering, oh my God. Love is a nasty thing. I mean, not just in the sense of kink. I mean, we understand that, right? But love is what causes war. Love is what causes killing and jealousy. I mean, we love our children, and yet we stigmatize them with our symptoms. You know, I think we have to get over the fact that, look, this is Hallmark. Hallmark, the company Hallmark, has been selling love to us in the form of cards. That's bullshit, you know? No, love is what it is. It's an incredibly powerful force between human beings, some kind of energy, yeah? And yet in the name of love, we commit genocide. In the name of love, we can commit all kinds of horrific violences. In the name of love, we accommodate capitalism. In the name of love, we embrace meritocracy. So I think, you know, this is one of the great revolutions in my mind, was that this thing called love that we all embrace as something that is purely a good thing. No. No, love is not going to alleviate human suffering. It's what's causing human suffering. So, you know, so here I think I'm going to introduce our favorite theorist, Samo's in mine, is Hegel. You know, we could learn a thing or two. Well, we could go to Aristotle, or we could go to all the philosophers that come from Asia as well on this. Look, we need to kind of embrace dialectics a little bit, right? Yeah, similarities and opposites flow through each other, and so please, you know, let's think about this love in a way that's more complicated than what the Disney company wants us to think. I know, too much. I know. Sorry. Apologies. There you go. You got an apology from me as well, Paulinho.
Thank you very much, Naeem. I think we've, you know, bombarded you with numberless questions and provocations. So we'll, you know, I really want to thank you immensely, Samo and Naeem, for your talks and for your provocations. I think it's very rare that we get to have a conversation on capitalism and Marx and their tension and Hegel, and it just works and we end up laughing. So thank you so much for that. I'm sure we'll rename the panel next year Capitalist Joy. See how that goes after love, right? So tomorrow we have one more panel at the same time to continue discussing climate catastrophe. More specifically, it's titled Planetary Catastrophe, Denial and Disavowal. We'll have with us Deborah Danowski from PUC-Rio, Françoise Vergès, which we've heard on the first day, and Robert Fletcher. So please, join us tomorrow for some more conversation, since once more, today's panel is already prefiguring tomorrow's conversation. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you all tomorrow.